Hello and welcome to Haunted by the Past. Today we look at Queenscliff and Australia's biggest fort defences. Fort Queenscliff in Victoria, Australia dates from 1860 when an open battery was constructed on Shortlands Bluff to defend the entrance to Port Phillip Bay. The fort, which underwent major redevelopment in the late 1870s and 1880s, became the headquarters for an extensive chain of forts around Port Phillip Heads. Its garrison included volunteer artillery, engineers, infantry and naval militia. And it was manned as a coastal defence installation continuously from 1883 to 1946. The other fortifications and armaments around the heads were completed by 1891 and together made Port Phillip one of the most heavily defended harbours in the British Empire. In 1939, Cottage by the Sea, built to offer care and accommodation for children recovering from an illness, was taken over by the Defence Department as a World War II military hospital, displaying the Red Cross on the roof and sides of the building to alert enemy planes. So it's no surprise then that there have been many deaths there, as it had an on-site morgue. In 1891, on the 4th of April, there was a particular tragic death which occurred at the fort. This is taken from the South Australian Chronicle. A fearful accident occurred at the Queenscliff Fort on Saturday when 2 members of the Geelong Battery were instantly killed and 2 more badly injured. The fatality was caused by the breach of one of the guns being blown out, apparently through the faulty sponging of the gun. At about 11:30, Corporal Brearley and gunners Ronaldson, Duggan and Merson of the Permanent Force Battery were firing one of the 5-ton breech loading guns with plugged shell. 1 round had been fired and preparations were being made for the second shot. Ronaldson had started the screw on the breech of the gun and had it about halfway on when a deafening explosion took place, the breech having burst. Brearley and Ronaldson were blown to pieces. The breech struck Brearley near the waist, tearing his body open in a terrible manner, while Ronaldson's body was torn open and a portion of his head was blown away. The other 2 gunners, named Duggan and Merson, were hurled to the ground and sustained painful injuries about the face and body. When picked up, it was found that the uniforms of the dead and injured men were almost completely burnt off them. I can't imagine what those men had to see that day, and with no understanding of PTSD back then, they would have just had to carry on as normal, as the ones who survived did, with those images forever imprinted on their memories. Corporal Brearley was just 38 years of age and left a wife and 8 children to mourn his death. Gunner Donaldson was just 24, single and a painter by trade, and survived by his mother. The funeral procession started down Hess Street in Queenscliff through to Geelong Eastern Cemetery, where they were laid to rest. Their deaths were felt by the Queenscliff community, and a public subscription throughout Queenscliff raised the equivalent of $100 to assist the families. With no counselling back then, the men would have just carried on as usual, but for some it did get too much. This is taken from the Geelong Advertiser, Wednesday the 29th of July, 1908. Queenscliff, Soldier's Suicide, a Queenscliff Barrack Tragedy. An inquest concerning the death of Bombardier Arthur Russell Shear of No. 6 Company RAA, which occurred on Monday under sensational circumstances already reported in the Advertiser, was held yesterday by Mr. William Simpkin, JP. Ernest Walter Moncrief, a bombardier, disposed that the deceased was a prisoner in his charge on Monday. At about 3 a.m, a witness had occasion to go to his box in the same room where the deceased was confined. He heard a shot ring out whilst his attention was diverted, and the deceased was leaning against a bed with his Lee-Enfield rifle grasped in his left hand and bleeding from a wound in the forehead. The doctor was telephoned for. Gunner Keane disposed of having seen the deceased in the Ozone Hotel on Saturday evening in company with Gunner Wiltshire. When they went up the slopes together, a disagreement took place and Wiltshire hit the deceased. Gunner Wiltshire gave a similar evidence. Dr. Pollock, who attended the deceased after he was shot, said that his injuries were such as could be produced by a high-velocity rifle fired at very close quarter. Death was due to the injuries received. Constable Brady stated that in addition to the letter which had been published in the press, a note giving instructions as to the disposal of his effects was found on the deceased. A verdict was recorded that the deceased died from effects of gunshot wound, self-inflicted. Yesterday afternoon, the deceased bombardier was accorded a military funeral in the local cemetery. Shear on Sunday morning was placed under arrest, accused by a comrade with a most serious offence. The actual charge was drunkenness. Shear was to have appeared before the officer commanding today, but the accusation, which he denied strenuously, evidently proved too much for his mental balance. This morning, after partaking of breakfast, he obtained a loaded rifle, placed the muzzle against his right temple, leaned down and pulled the trigger. The top part of his head was blown off, but notwithstanding this terrible injury, Shear lingered for about 2 hours. On searching the dead man's effects, Constable Brady found 2 letters which showed that Shear preferred death to dishonour. The letters were written in a firm hand and contained emphatic denials of any criminal evidence. So that's really quite sad that he decided to kill himself rather than face a charge of dishonour. And that kind of shows you the state of mind that these men were in. I'm not sure whether this man had been in the war or whether he was just stationed at Queenscliff, but even so, that's still a horrible thing to hear about. And it's still happening today, unfortunately. An accidental shooting, Queenscliff, the 10th of February 1899. According to newspaper reports of the time, a lamentable shooting incident happened at the time of roll call around 10:15 p.m. in room 3. The men were preparing for bed when Gunner Pollock handled his carbine when the non-commissioned officer in charge of the room told him to replace the weapon at once. But Pollock decided to turn to a group of men and ask if they dared him to shoot. Another gunner, Brinner, replied, "That is always your bluff." But as he finished, Pollock turned his gun on him. It is not known if he accidentally touched the trigger or not when it went off. Unfortunately for Brinner, who was 15 feet away, took the bullet in the chest under his right nipple and passed through his lung, and continued his journey past the head of another man who was luckily unlacing his boots before coming to a stop embedded in the wall between Barrack 3 and 4. Pollock was immediately arrested. The doctor attended to Brinner and was placed in a critical condition. It was first thought that Brinner would be okay. Pollock was removed from the barrack cells and taken to Geelong jail. There was no inclination that the two didn't get on. Later recorded on the 16th of February 1899 in the Emu Times, the man Brinner who was shot by a comrade has succumbed to his injuries. End quote. On the 17th of February, the funeral of the unfortunate gunner Brinner took place today at Melbourne Cemetery with military honours. The ceremony was most impressive, large crowds following the cortege through the streets. So what happened to Pollock? From
Pollock's prison record, we can find the following details: that he was 6'3", had brown hair and eyes. He was born in 1873 on the 10th of January and was a native of India. He was Church of England religion. He could read and write. He was christened at the Bombay Presidency at Belgaum. His mother was Eliza and his father Alexander, who was a master of the Second Queen's Armed Forces. His trial was in Ballarat. The offences he had: Ballarat jail. He was admitted on the 13th of April 1899, so after the murder. On the 11th of July 1901, it was recorded an offence as making use of inappropriate language. At P.E. Pentridge jail, he was admitted on the 19th of April 1899, and it was recorded, so he must have gone to Pentridge after Ballarat jail. He was only at Geelong jail a short time, I think 3 weeks. Is reported on the 21st of October of 1901. He was done for larceny of stealing 3 fat cakes and a roast of beef. So interesting. I can't find any more information out than that, so I don't know if there's a possible record that could be him, that he died in 1948 in his 70s, but I can't confirm that that is actually him. I can't find anything else about his life, like what he went on to do, what he did after that. It's interesting. I always find it sad that these people who've gone to jail and lived into the 70s, victims, unfortunately had their lives cut short. The person, Brinner, who he shot, was only 23, I think, or 20s. It's very sad. The next one is an accidental shooting again, but in 1941.
On a recent trip to Queenscliff Fort, in the museum there was another accidental shooting from a soldier. This occurred in 1941 on December the 16th, and John Joseph Maroney, aged 23, was killed by an accidental discharge of a rifle. It was detailed in an inquest soon after his unfortunate passing. The transcript from the Melbourne Herald Sun at the time stated, Staff Sergeant Tormey said that he heard a gunshot. Gunner Maroney fell over and died 5 minutes later. On investigation, it was found that the shot had come through a wall of a wooden hut, Soldiers' Barracks hut. Corporal John Amos stated that he was emptying his rifle's magazine and in doing so accidentally discharged a round. The image you see on screen is of Gunner John Maroney, who was buried at Koroit in Victoria.
So it's not just isolated to the 1800s, it also happened throughout the history of the fort. Many things happened there, accidentally or on purpose, as in the murder of 1942. As told in a recent video about the 1942 double murders at the fort, there have been many sightings of Gunner John Holston around the magazine shelters in the tunnels at night at the fort, and anyone who discovers him on duty must treat him as a normal soldier who has not left their duty. The military states, and this was quoted from Reddit, that ghosts aren't real, but soldiers that are still on duty are. So if you look at my video, my first video, you will see what they have to say if they encounter Gunner John Holston on site. If he was on PK duty, then they would say, "Pass friend, all is well." If he was on sentry duty, then they would say, "Gunner Holston, I relieve you of your duties." He is not just seen by military personnel, but also by visitors. Unfortunately, I didn't encounter John Holston, but when I had a ghost tube app running, I did get through "You shouldn't be here." Could that have been John Holston still on duty in the magazine shelters? Who knows? I've also heard accounts that you do see soldiers on the parade ground still doing their parades, which would be fascinating to see. When I caught up with the author Bob Marmion for the video that I did on the murder at the fort murders, he told one of his own personal stories. He's a fort historian at Queenscliff Fort, and
he was working in the admin building at night, which incidentally used to be the actual Fort Hospital before they used Cottage by the Sea in World War II. This was prior to World War II. He says, whilst working in the admin building upstairs late at night, I heard footsteps on the stairs. So thinking someone was playing a joke on me, I crept down the stairs and rounded the corner and cried, "Boo!" thinking that there would be someone there to scare. But there was no one there. As I looked and turned, I saw footprints in the carpet ascending the stairs. Wow, could this have been Gunner John Holston still on duty? Or could it have been one of our poor unfortunate soldiers that were accidentally killed whilst on duty by another soldier? Interesting. Another tale from a tour guide, Viv Lewis. She said that another feeling of a presence in the admin building has also been felt by a lady also working there at night. She apparently was walking down the corridor and felt a sharp pain in her arm, like someone had just hit it. And the pain developed all the way down her arm. Later, she discovered that a soldier had had his arm amputated when it used to be the Fort Hospital. So that's another interesting story there. Now, this may not be directly related to Queenscliff Fort. However, the street in question is just down the way from Crow's Nest Army Camp in the 1940s. And one of the houses there is reported to have a spirit called William. Now, the owner of the house has wanted to remain anonymous, so I'm not going to reveal the street name or the number, obviously. But the house in question houses a spirit of a soldier. They're not sure what time he came from, as in we don't know what war uniform he was wearing, from accounts recalled. However, from one of the young relatives that visits the house, they actually saw the spirit of William in the hallway, I believe, and the child asked their mother, "Why is that army man there?" So that's how they know that the man isn't from the army, he's dressed in army uniform. But the occupants of the house originally named him Harold before they knew, until one night they were awoken by Harold. And it said that they told them that his name wasn't Harold, his name was William, which is interesting. On another occasion, the couple were in the house as usual, and whilst the lady of the house was taking a shower, the gentleman of the house was watching a demolition across the road at the time, at the front of the house, which is where William is meant to stay. He was gently tapped on the shoulder. Now, thinking it was his wife, he turned round, expecting to see her stood there. However, she was still in the shower, and there was no one there. So that's very interesting too. What do you think? This was very nearby Crow's Nest Camp, so it is possible that it could have been a soldier from days past, which is why I've linked it with this video. Now, I did go on and did a very brief search on soldiers that lost their lives during World War I and II, and there came up a few people called William. There was a William Henry Allison that lived in Hess Street, which is not far from this street in question. They died, I believe, around World War I believe. There was another soldier also died in World War I, William Leslie MacDonald. So the William Henry Allison was from Queenscliff, but I believe William Leslie MacDonald died in Queenscliff. So that could have been at the Fort Hospital, who knows? But this street is not far from Crow's Nest Barracks, and also not far from Cottage by the Sea, which was a military hospital in the Second World War. So it's interesting that William could be from either war or even predates World War I and II. Let me know your comments below. I think it's fascinating. Have you ever visited Fort Queenscliff, and do you have any stories? Let me know in your comments below, or you can email me at the email address in the About info. Thank you for listening. This has been Haunted by the Past. Until next time, stay spooky.